Well, welcome everybody. I would like to welcome Melissa Bravo. She is the former noxious, invasive, and poison plant specialist for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. Melissa's career has spanned 25 years of working in cropland, non-cropland, and right-of-way vegetation management, as well as poisonous plant control. She is currently working on an agricultural herd health program called Foraging Through the Weeds of Climate Change at Rutgers Cooperative Extension in Salem County, New Jersey. This evening, she is going to talk to us about Kudzu, Akebia, and Wisteria. We are being recorded, and if people could just make sure their microphones are off. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. How are you? Thank you for having me today. I've shortened up this presentation that I'm going to give you on semi-woody vines of the Mid-Atlantic region. The original presentation is one that I put together when I worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, and I wanted to give them credit for some of the slides that you'll see here. Some of the slides are mine from when I worked as a noxious and invasive plant specialist for my own consulting company. And then I currently work for Rutgers, the New Jersey Agriculture Experiment Station in Salem County, and want to give them credit for hosting this on their platform. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk to you about how to identify herbaceous vines from woody vines. And when I say woody vine, I mean like this one right here. And we'll see if anyone wants to guess which vine this is after I go through the talk. But I'm going to give you a quick taxonomic definition of the difference between a herbaceous weed or a herbaceous vine and a woody vine. So a woody vine is also known as a liana or liana, and we sometimes call them semi-woody vines, but both of those terms mean it's a plant that produces wood as its structural tissue. And when we think of wood, we think of the wood that we would have if this was a pencil, the hard core, and then the inside of the pencil is our lead. And you often see that core distinction in a woody vine, and you will not see that in a herbaceous vine. So a plant that is considered a woody vine or semi-woody vine has that hard exterior stem, and it also has buds that grow along the stem, and those buds are what allow it to survive over the winter. It also has a perennial root system that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And for our purpose today, most of the woody and semi-woody vines have that twining around or liana characteristic. So I've listed on the other side of this column the plants that are considered woody and semi-woody vines. We're going to talk about Oriental bittersweet today. Some of you have seen Boston ivy climbing up chimneys. We have calamanthus. English ivy is another one that's very hard to distinguish from Boston ivy. We have our native grapes and our imported grapes. We have the twining Japanese honeysuckle vine, the poisonous ivy. Virginia creeper is creeps along the ground, but you'll see it climbing up structures. Wisteria, porcelain berry, kudzu, and I'm going to talk about kudzu and akebia in this talk. Those woody vines we can distinguish from what we call the broadleaf vines, and those vines are vascular and they do not have persistent woody parts underground. So if you can pull those vines out of the ground and see a very herbaceous root system like what you would see on a carrot or what you would see on a clover plant, that's a good way to make a distinction. And for the herbaceous vines, their leaves will desiccate annually. Some of them might be slightly evergreen and they lose their vines or their leaves, but they go into a state of dormancy over the winter as opposed to our woody ones. And I've listed some of those here that you might be familiar with. So cat's briar, greenbrier, That will lose its leaves, but it'll still have the thorns, and you might run into the brambles in the wintertime. Mile-a-minute vine has thorns, but once temperatures get cold, that vine desiccates to the ground. Swallowwort vine is one you might not be familiar with. That's in the milkweed family. Wild cucumber, burr cucumber, those are commonly seen in agriculture fields and along riparian areas. And then we have wild buckwheat vine and Japanese hops, and all of those desiccate down to the ground once we get cold temperatures. So here's a few examples before we move back into the woodies. This is swallowwort. It's in the milkweed family. So it can be quite the thicket of vine during the growing season, but once it matures or once we get killing frost, it's going to fall back down to the ground. Japanese hops can be quite the thicket of herbaceous vegetation, but again, it's all an annual growth, and that's going to die back to the ground. Here in our region, the ones that you're going to see that are semi-woody or woody are kudzu, although it's rare in the mid-Atlantic. Akebia is rare in the mid-Atlantic. Black swallowwort is rare in the mid-Atlantic. Japanese hops is a herbaceous vine. It's rare in the mid-Atlantic, but between those four species, the further you get to the south, Lancaster County, Philadelphia, Allegheny, more of your urban counties, you start to see regionally within a locality, they're very, they can become more common. That's opposed to the ones that are common in the whole mid-Atlantic region. So just about any state that you go to in the mid-Atlantic, any part of the state, you may run into oriental bittersweet, wild cucumber, wild buckwheat, and wild grape. And I put wisteria in this category. It's not widespread in the region as an escape, but it is widespread in the region as a cultural ornamental plant. So I can go into just about any county in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and find wisteria planted somewhere. So I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on these vines: wisteria, kudzu, akebia, and oriental bittersweet, and just go back and forth and compare them to some of the other vines you might come across. So for wisteria, we have different species of wisteria: American, Chinese, and Japanese. So American wisteria is, the scientific name is frutescens. Chinese wisteria is senescens, and Japanese wisteria is floribunda. And one of the main characteristics, if you're really interested in knowing which one you're dealing with, is that American goes clockwise around the tree. Chinese sinensis goes the other counterclockwise around the tree, and Japanese is going clockwise. If you have an opportunity to compare the leaves, or if you're trying to determine which one you have, when you look at those compound leaves, which are very similar to an ash tree or a tree of heaven tree in morphology, but look at those leaflets. American wisteria has 5 to 19 leaflets. Chinese wisteria has 9 to 11 leaflets, and Japanese wisteria has 9 to 11. So American generally has more leaflets than the other two. The key characteristic with wisteria, though, is the color of the bark. And by the bark, I'm referring to this part of the bark. American wisteria has a very light gray bark. Chinese wisteria is more gray-brown in color, and Japanese wisteria is very white compared to the other two species. So when we look at wisteria, you can see in the images here, which I borrowed from the US Forest Service, wisteria, as it twines around the tree, has that characteristic giant snake appearance. The bark of the vine has big white splotches. So if you look at that photograph, it kind of looks like lichens in its color pattern. That's a good indication that you're dealing with wisteria as opposed to one of the other species. And the leaves are alternate, but the leaves are opposite. So the picture you see at the bottom is showing you the leaflets. on a leaf that is alternate on the stem. The pods of Wisteria look like coffee bean pods as opposed to what you're going to see on Kudzu, which are pea-like. But the purple flowers that we have in Wisteria, and I don't have a picture here on this slide, but they're in that pendulous raceme, which is color-wise catches your eyes, but it is slightly different from Kudzu, which is a legume. And I'll show you that in the next picture. And I did want to mention from my own experience in cutting these vines with the Department of Agriculture that you can have a phytophotodermal reaction from cutting Wisteria. Maybe 1% of the population can get a cellulitis reaction, but you can get a very large watery blister from the sap of Wisteria. So you want to be cognitive of that if you're cutting a big vine. And as far as poisonous characteristics, the seeds are toxic, so do not eat Wisteria seeds. That's important to know if you're working as a volunteer in this type of ecosystem where there's some poisonous plants and others are not. So in the difference here, this is Kudzu. So does anyone see the similarity between the vine in my picture and the vine in my hand? So Kudzu is very much like a very brown snake. And it's a very stiff vine. So the vine in the photograph and the vine in my hand, in fact, this could be the vine that you see in the photograph. They are very corky in their interior wood, and that gives them the strength to stand up on their own and climb up into trees. And that's a very good characteristic once you handle Kudzu vines. There's the flower of Kudzu, which is somewhat similar to Wisteria, but it is a pea flower, whereas Wisteria is hanging down in that raceme. And the key characteristics of Kudzu is it is a legume. So it has very large leaflets like a lima bean, although the leaflets are significantly bigger than a lima bean. Again, the stem is very corky, extremely lightweight. And if you get into the root tuber, which is what determines that it is a woody vine, it has a yam-like structure for the roots. And you'll see 3 ropes coming off the roots that anchor it. And that's a very key characteristic of the Kudzu root. And if you cut into the vine or if you cut into the root, it smells like licorice. The difference between Kudzu and Wisteria is that the seeds are not toxic. And I'm sure you've read that Kudzu has been used for many therapeutic purposes and continues to be used as a herbal drug. I have a link here that you can follow that takes you to some information about Kudzu and how it's the vine that ate the South. It's rather interesting that since we've been saying that over 25 years, there's been a shift in the acreage and range of Kudzu in the South, whether that's climate change or management strategies, but we're seeing a huge reduction in acres infested with Kudzu. Again, this was a species that was purposely planted for agriculture purposes, and the remnants of that were what became invasive along the edges of those fields in the South. And I'll touch a little bit on what we have here in the Mid-Atlantic region. So this was when I was working with Pennsylvania, and I just wanted to throw this in here so you think about rare. This is all the sites in Pennsylvania that I surveyed from 2009 data. And when I left in 2012, there was around 116 sites, and I think I've identified 2 more since then. So all told, in the entire state of Pennsylvania, if we added up the volume of those sites infested, it came to 58 acres. So that's not a significant amount of an escape from cultivation as compared to the South, where millions and millions of acres were purposely seeded with Kudzu. The difference between Kudzu and Akebia, this is an Akebia vine, and if you can see those little brown lenticels on there, that is a very key characteristic of Akebia that you can use to identify it from Kudzu or Oriental bittersweet. But the key characteristic of Akebia is it does have 5 leaflets. So we think about leaves of 5 are Virginia creeper, but Akebia is a semi-evergreen. So those leaves have a very leathery feel to them. and they stay on there for almost all the year. And the flower structure is very different from the other two. It is purple, but it has a very characteristic flower structure, and the seed pods are very characteristic. You oftentimes don't see the seed pods, but if you do, they're hanging down in a very large, looks like almost like an open clamshell. But the flowers themselves look more like the flowers from your fuchsia. If you're familiar with the fuchsia flower that you get at the garden center. In some cultures, this is eaten. So Akebia, if you accidentally were to ingest Akebia, it's not known to be toxic. And again, I have a video link there. It's actually a good video link on how to manage Akebia, or how to train your Akebia, depending on how you look at it. So this slide here is on Oriental bittersweet. We've heard a lot about Oriental bittersweet over the years. We have our native, natural Oriental bittersweet, and then we have our invasive. And to get to that level of identification I'm not going to cover that today, but the important thing to know, if you're trying to identify different vines from bittersweet, kudzu, wisteria, poison ivy, is that when you cut into bittersweet, the inside of the vine is orange. The roots are very bright orange. The vines themselves are very white, and they have little tiny black speckles on them. And when they wrap around this tree, they look like a white python. And you have to get up close to see the speckles. And then it kind of has this like fishnet appearance. The leaves are opposite on Oriental bittersweet, and they're spoon shaped. So you can see them on this tree. Each one of those leaflets looks like a spoon with a serrated edge, whereas kudzu leaves would be heart shaped, just like a lima bean plant. Oriental bittersweet seeds are not known to be toxic, but they're not known to be tasty either. So I wouldn't recommend trying to eat them. This is an excellent 4-minute video from Penn State on accurate identification of Oriental bittersweet that I would recommend you watch. I'm not able to click on the link in this presentation. I apologize for that. So this is a vine that I've identified as poison ivy, and I'm just wondering, at the end of the slide, we'll see if you can pick out some of the characteristics that I saw when I took this on my walk the other day. In this presentation, and I don't know if you can see my arrow floating along the vine, but do you see those little hairs? They look like your eyelashes coming off the vine. Those little aerial roots are how a poison ivy attaches to trees and structures and is able to climb. And those are absent from kudzu, they're absent from wisteria, they're absent from akebia. And we have the leaves of 3 let it be that we're so familiar with poison ivy. But everything you see in this picture is a wad of poison ivy vines. So there's really a lot to look at there. And you can see that the poison ivy vines have that same gray appearance as some of the other vines that I talked about, but the key characteristic there are those little hairy roots. Now, English ivy is also a tree climber, and that's what you see here. And English ivy also has those aerial roots that help it attach and adhere to the tree, but the bark is quite different. Can you see how the bark of English ivy is very variegated, similar to the leaves? Has very deep grooves in it. And the leaves are entire and look like a maple leaf, whereas poison ivy, they are very divested. So this is a photograph of the vines of wild grape mixed into a bunch of other invasive species. What I wanted you to focus on is to look for those tendrils, those hooks that are reaching out. And that's how wild grapes are able to climb. And that's a key characteristic that you can pick out between wild grape. Kudzu has those same type of tendrils, but kudzu vines are a legume. And so they're just like your little spring pea vine when they reach out like that tendril. They don't get woody like wild grape. So management checklist, and I just need to minimize my window so I can see what I'm saying. I wanted to put this on here so you think about when you're trying to identify vines and you're trying to decide how to manage them, and I'll go into some of the options here in the next slide. Think about delineating your site descriptors. Is it roadside? Is it a playground? Is it next to a hospital? Is it going to be a park where people are hiking? Or is it truly a native plant preserve? Is it part of the cultural landscape? And then choose your control options based on those site descriptors, because that's going to help you focus on what you can and can't do on a limited budget and with limited human resource hours. Timing wise, depending on that site descriptor, you may be applying your control measures in the spring, winter, or fall. So it's always helpful to write up a prescription for each one, because the options you use will change. And then once you write up the prescription, include mechanical options, chemical options, and biological options so you can accomplish your goal. And I'll talk about some of them here. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is something that I would go through with a property owner when I was the noxious weed control program manager, and I had quarantined a site on their property. So we would go through the checklist to see if we could use mechanical, chemical, or biological. But we also have to look then at local, regional, state, and federal ordinances to see what we can and cannot do. And if we, for example, want to burn a pile of kudzu in a quarry in Willow Grove, do I have to get an air quality permit waiver from EPA? So that was a real world example that we ran into when we were trying to remove a kudzu site. And then you also need to look at your program objectives and your funding objectives so that you can accomplish those goals. So mechanical options with any of these vines, the easiest way to try to deal with something that's in small infestation is if you can dig it out, try to dig it out. Some of these vines you can dig out with the shovels, other you need a spade. If you're dealing with kudzu, you need a root knife to cut that tuber off. We used a backhoe to dig out some of the kudzu sites. So if you have a heavily infested area that's just impossible to penetrate, you might want to think about just destroying the whole site and starting over. You need your hand knife, your hand snips, and if you're going to start dealing with vines that are tangled up with trees, live or dead, you're going to need a chainsaw. Your chemical options can be combined with those mechanical choices, but we have different techniques that we refer to. So a root cut application is something I would use for kudzu, for any of those woody vines. I would not use a root cut application on a herbaceous plant because there isn't enough root there to cut. A stump cut treatment and a stem cut application can be used on living vines. You wouldn't use those on vines that are dead or on very, very small vines because there wouldn't be enough material there for you to inject the material into. And that's when we switch over to a foliar application that's either going to be translocated up into the foliage or systemically down into the roots. But we have biological options that we can use to control many of these vines. We can drown them. We have drought, which is very beneficial in some of these shallow rooted vines or in areas that have just become infested. We can suffocate them with plastic, basically depriving them of light in any manner that we can. And then we have a lot of grazing options for the vines that are not toxic that animals will consume. And I've listed many of them here, including our insects, because they're biologically grazing on the vines. You can use a combination of grazing, mechanical, and chemical to clear up a large infestation area. So just in closing, think about prioritizing your limited dollars and resources. And think about the fact that if it's an escape from cultivation, it's rarely been planted over time if it's rarely escaped now. So in reference to that, I think of Akebia. Akebia is very rare as an escape from cultivation in the mid-Atlantic region, and I would dare say probably in the Southeast. But where it's been abandoned and forgotten about and has gone to seed, you can get into some extensive patches of it. However, if it was purposely planted as a crop and then widely distributed in the landscape over time, that becomes more common. For example, Japanese barberry. If it's a noxious weed capable of limiting food production, that's something, if you're dealing with wanting to convert a property back into a garden or food production, you want to think about the weeds that are there, like your Candida thistles as an example. If it's poisonous to livestock and humans and you're planning on having humans or livestock in that area, you would focus more on those species. And lastly, just look at the whole property when you're trying to pick out which vines you want to target. Can early detection, rapid response limit the spread to other properties, or is there such an extensive seed bank there after 50 years that your efforts are worthwhile and noteworthy, but next year there's going to be a flush and it's going to all the vines are going to grow back again. So we want to thank you for all the work that you do. And I want to thank Penn State University, the Department of Agriculture, and Rutgers and Salem County for hosting this presentation today on their webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa.
You're welcome. Now, can I find the screen again?
We had a question from Bill, which is, what do you recommend doing with the stems and the debris after cutting?
Well, I brought the kudzu home with me. So did anyone figure out that this was kudzu? So it depends on the species. It depends on the species and the age. So if you're getting into vines that are thorny, just cutting them and leaving them there is an option, but it depends on the purpose of the site. So if it's a good, let's say it's going to be a playground. I had a playground that I treated in Philadelphia during the non-growing season, or non-kids. There were no kids in school, but we had to decide how to treat the kudzu because it was taking over the playground. So you have to think about, can you leave those thorny vines there, or do you have to remove them? And in many instances, we're bagging and tagging. So we're taking them off the property and disposing of them. If they're on the noxious weed list, we would bag and tag them because we didn't want the seeds to stay behind, especially if the vines have fruit on them. So if you can grind them, multifloral rows, once it becomes a vine and goes up into the trees, you're getting those thorns into your hands no matter what. And those thorns in and of themselves can be toxic. So you really have to think about how much you want to handle them. Digging a hole and burying them is one option, especially if they're extensive. I'm thinking of the massive Oriental bittersweet and foxgrape that gets all intertwined. If you can rip that down and just push it into a hole, you've removed a great mass of it. And the ones that aren't 25, 30, 40 years old, you can just cut those larger vines down and leave them on the ground if they're not causing a problem. Or you can take them home and put them in your shelf for a curiosity piece.
Now I realized that I was reading, well, I was reciting Bill's question by memory, but actually he was saying, asking about uprooted vines. So if you have uprooted the vine and you're dealing with the roots, would that change your answer? I guess you obviously wouldn't bury them, but do you think it's okay to just leave them on the top of the ground to desiccate?
Yeah, so for kudzu, kudzu is kind of unique because it's a state noxious weed. So we were killing the tubers. So if we were using only mechanical or cultural practices, we were putting those on plastic or putting them in bags until they died. If you were doing Akebia, I've never dug out Akebia, so I don't know how deep in the ground it roots, but any woody vine has the ability to produce a bud above the root mass. So you would definitely want to cut the stem below the growing point where it's coming off the root, and then just destroy that part of the root. And that may be grinding it. Again, you can drown it. If you can drown a root mass, depriving it of, turning it into a anaerobic environment, and it's not going to sprout. That would be one option.
Okay. Todd is asking, when using glyphosate, is 45% concentration appropriate for treating the cut, kudzu, and alanthus, or should you use a different concentration?
Well, on your cut stump treatments for the label is the law, but if we think about you gave me two different species there. So for kudzu, 2.5% to a 5% volume per volume would kill kudzu. So that would be 2.5% in the bottle. If this was my, oh, that doesn't look like a good bottle. If this was my bottle, 2.5% of the volume of this water would be the 45% solution of Roundup. And you could go up to a 5% volume per volume on kudzu vines and do a very good job. So the 45% concentrate of Roundup is the concentrate in the jug it comes in. You could make a 5% solution of that in a cut stump bottle, and that should be sufficient for tree heaven. It really depends on how well a good job you do making the cut and how big the volume of the tree is. If I was doing a foliar application, I would be doing with a 45% solution. I would still be mixing that up, looking at the label rate for a foliar application, which would be closer to, maybe 2.5 quarts to the acre. And then we would back that down to how many square feet we're spraying. And there was another part there you asked.
That was it.
Okay.
Yeah, that was it. Okay, that's interesting. A question I had at the very beginning, you mentioned that it's the buds above ground that allow the vine to overwinter. Can you explain that? What do you mean by that?
So on woody vines, down here at the base where the root is, you're going to get buds on that root collar. And they survive above the ground. And then if this vine, as this vine has gone up the tree, this is kudzu. Kudzu will develop a knot, and that knot will be a bud or a living tissue, whereas with herbaceous, everything just desiccates. So if this was herbaceous, my hair, in the winter time, there would be no buds left. The hair would all fall off and it would have to re-sprout the next year from a growing point.
Okay.
That's the best way I could answer that.
Very good. You're bald in the winter. We got you. If I understand correctly, then we know that when you dig up Oriental bittersweet, it likes to re-sprout, and the same with the honeysuckle. If you don't get a lot of the roots, and even if you do get a lot of the roots, but you're saying that kudzu, luckily, you don't have to worry about that as long as you get the tuber out.
Kudzu is a sweet potato root, and it has it'll always have at least 3 roots coming off of it. You have to get all 3 roots. So we had a root knife about this long, it was serrated. And when kudzu comes off the ground, it looks like a rope, 3 different ropes coming off of the sweet potato, and it's a knot. So we would cut down into the ground and we would cut those 3 roots off, and we never saw the root part that we cut off resprout, because it's pulling all of its source from that tuber. So when you follow kudzu through a patch, the ropes are going out along the ground, parallel to the ground, and they'll anchor. And anywhere they anchored, there's another tuber.
Oh, no.
So we learned to just ignore the length of the rope until we got to another anchor point, and then we would cut that tuber and go on to the next. And that seemed to work very well for how kudzu expands its range on the ground until it decides to climb a tree. I haven't dug up a lot of Oriental bittersweet, but honeysuckle is going to have it has a shallow root system, but it's semi-woody. It's a woody plant, so if you leave enough growing tissue in the ground, it could resprout if it was an older plant. But younger plants probably wouldn't have enough root energy to resprout. So the size of the plant and how old it is probably has something to do with how much reservoir there is in those roots.
Well, they all seem to want to resprout for me on my property, no matter what I do. Okay, so sorry, I'm still not entirely clear. It sounds like you have to do as much digging for kudzu as for anything else.
Well, I never had to dig for kudzu. Kudzu just looks like ropes on the ground. And then right here on the ground, it'll form a knot.
Oh, I
And then
see.
under
It's
the
above
knot
ground.
Under the knot is a potato.
Oh, now I get you. Okay.
So it's never underground except where the tuber forms.
That clarifies.
Whereas your wisteria, you planted it and it's growing up and climbing and it's rerooting. I never saw kudzu reroot because it's a legume. So it's very much in the pea family. We don't see pea families leaning over and resprouting.
Mhm.
The Akebia that I saw, I only worked with Akebia in 2 spots, and that was very much a tendril climber vine, trellis vine that was just expanding its range. I didn't see that rooting into the ground. What's the other? Oriental bittersweet is a climber and just a prolific seed producer. I haven't worked enough with Oriental bittersweet to know if it reroutes into the ground, but your grapes don't. So I think it's more that you've got a lot of different seeds that have sprouted, and you've got all those roots intermingled with each other. And as you're cleaning it out, you're just getting more seed sprouting and more seed sprouting.
Okay.
That would be my,
That's
the kudzu sites were, they've been in Pennsylvania for over 100 years. I think the oldest site I looked at was 88 years old, but they started producing seed pods and viable seed about 20 years into their growth. But those seeds were raining down in the thicket and weren't producing a lot of seed until we killed the parent canopy and we let all the light in, and then all the seeds sprouted. So there's a long life cycle there as to how much dormancy and how viable the seeds are. And Oriental bittersweets are they stick around a long time. That's why they're so prolific, the same as your wild grapes. But Akebia is very difficult to get it to produce seeds. So most of the Akebia patches that you might come across are probably spreading vegetatively.
Okay. All right, anyone else have any questions? All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Oh, you're welcome.
And
so
we learned a lot of different things that we hadn't heard before, so really appreciate it.
Thank you. Now, keep in mind, this is, if you see a really giant Oriental bittersweet or wisteria, you won't see an older Akebia vine, but some of those Oriental bittersweet vines can get to be like this big around. And those are good specimens to have. If you come across something like that, let me know.
Okay, we're happy to send you all our
just a specimen. Just a specimen.
All right, great. Okay, terrific. Well, thank you very much. I'll just ask the audience if anyone had any comments about our tree rescuer program or questions or thoughts they wanted to share at this time. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording.